Hello everyone, this is Kawainame TV. This video is all about what if Naruto born with red hair. This story is a fanfiction. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Kindly click the bell button for more updates. Chapter 1. Hope and Ambition. By the time Uzumaki Naruto had turned 5 years old, he had come to realize that a good majority of the people in his village hated him. It was not an immediate realization. As the haze of colors and sounds called infancy slowly but inevitably passed, he first came into the awareness of his individuality. Looking down at his stubby toes and observing how they wriggled at his every command, he saw that he was his own person, his body and mind belonged to him and only him, and as far as he could tell, every other person that he saw possessed this right. All of the people in his village were the same as him in this regard. However, he gradually began to see differences between these other people and himself. When Naruto first visited the village playground at the age of 4, he saw many other children running around in the dust. Another young boy was chasing them making threatening sounds, and Naruto felt rather frightened. However, the other children were laughing as if they were having fun. When he asked another child what was going on, he looked at Naruto strangely and asked him if he'd never played tag before. When Naruto returned to his home that evening and asked his caretaker, a stern-faced woman with dark hair, about the game, she merely slammed a bowl of rice down on his table and told him to stay away from the other children. He didn't understand why the other children could play tag together and why he couldn't, but his caretaker's hand was even faster and sharper than her words, so he shut up and ate his dinner. But from then on, though he didn't approach the other children, Naruto did start going out more by himself. He was starting to get sick of the tattered book of folk tales that he had thumbed through since he was 2, and felt that he was a bit too old for the cracked old wooden blocks he'd once fondly stacked for hours before. He was a whole 5 years old, after all. And besides, he quite enjoyed the feel of the sun and wind on his skin. The few times Naruto had been out in public before, he had usually been with his caretaker, who always insisted on him covering his head and lower face with a scarf. She told him it was so that he wouldn't pick up any diseases, but now that he was exploring the streets of his village, he was beginning to have second thoughts. Because wherever he went, inevitably, he was followed by an intense storm of heated whispering. He hadn't realized at first, even following the realization of his individuality, he'd never thought of himself as particularly unique. He'd read before in his book of folk tales that no two snowflakes were alike, and as such, so were people. But in the winter, when snow covered the village, there were so many snowflakes that he couldn't possibly distinguish between them. This, he realized, could be the same for himself, and for everyone else. And yet somehow, these people managed to point him out, a single snowflake in a flurry of snow. They pointed him out with barely disguised grimaces, they ushered their children away from him, admonishing them for walking too close to him, and chased him out of their stores. The first time this happened, Naruto wondered if they wanted to play tag with him and was about to open his mouth to ask, when they slammed the door in his face, sending dust flying in his face. Before he could get up, he heard a spitting sound, and he felt a warm sensation on his face. When he touched his face and looked at his hand, it was wet. He immediately returned to his home afterwards. Ignoring the dinner his caretaker had left out on the table, Naruto crawled into his bed with the lights off and the blinds to his window closed shut. He stared into the darkness for the rest of the day, trembling. All of the following days that he went outside ended quite similarly. As time went on, even the other children began to notice him, and unlike the adults, they went out of their way to taunt him. Naruto observed this all and every night, stared into the darkness. After the initial shock had worn off, he began to ponder his situation, trying to find an answer to the question of why he, as an individual, was targeted in such a manner. He wondered if it was because of his appearance. After all, when he ventured outside with his scarf on, nobody treated him like an aberration, or even worse, pretend he didn't exist. If they accidentally bumped into him they apologized, and if he bumped into someone, they pet his head when he apologized. Recently, some of the other children had started to call him Tomato Head, because of the shock of red hair that framed his thin face, but he did not think that could be why he was singled out so much. He had examined his features quite closely at one point. His hair color was a bit unusual, but he had seen others with brightly colored hair in the playground quite a few times, and nobody ever glared at them or said unkind things to them. He had blue eyes, a quite ordinary trait, and though he was a bit small for his age, he was in no way deformed. He had counted carefully. He had one head, a face with all of its features, 2 arms, hands, and feet, and 10 fingers and toes. Just like every other child, some of the adults sometimes were missing a finger or a limb. In fact, the only really unique thing about him was the pair of faint whisker-like birthmarks on his cheeks. Naruto had noticed that some of the village clans, like the Inuzuka clan, had physical markers for their members. So sometimes, he liked to sit in front of a mirror and imagine what it'd be like to have other people who had bright red hair and whisker marks on their faces. And then inevitably, his thoughts would turn to his dead parents. He knew that he was an orphan, and that they had died on the same day he was born. His caretaker had told him that much. His situation was fairly common following the Third Shinobi World War and the attack of the Nine Tails. His apartment was not too far from the orphanage, which teemed with children. In fact, Naruto hadn't even realized that he didn't have parents until he saw for the first time an adult picking up one of the children at the playground. Looking into the darkness, his thoughts unimpeded by jeers and glares, Naruto eventually came to a conclusion. Having compared his behavior to that of other children, he knew that he himself could not be at fault for the behavior of the village people towards him. He never asked for anything that he didn't need, he ate almost all of his vegetables, and he always obeyed his caretaker. He briefly wondered whether he was just ugly, but upon hesitantly asking his caretaker, she'd snorted and told him to stop asking her stupid questions and to finish his soup. So Naruto finished his soup, and after tossing and turning in bed that night, decided he couldn't control whether he was ugly or not, and anyone who thought otherwise, well, they were the stupid ones. Despite his brave thoughts, however, Naruto didn't go out the following morning, and instead remained curled up in his bed. By the time he finally got up and pulled up the blinds, the afternoon sun was high in the sky. As the summer glow warmed his face, Naruto dully listened to the sounds of the village people passing by below, the chatter of their daily life resounding in his ears. Pick up some eggs from the market, won't step a foot in the library, you know, he's gone for a week to Wind Country. Naruto's eyes flew open. Wind Country. While he knew that he lived in Konoha, the hidden village of Fire Country, the thought that there were other countries had never occurred to him. Yet thinking about it now, it seemed such an obvious thing. He'd never left the village himself, but he'd seen the gates opening and closing many times, and seen the travelers and merchants streaming in and out. Though the small glimpses of the outside he'd managed to get through the gates showed only a forest, he realized now, those people must have been headed somewhere. It was then that a sudden terrible, amazing, alien thought came to him: maybe, he could join them. It had never even been a possibility to Naruto before, but he felt himself quickly warming up to the idea. Since the people in his village didn't want him. Yes, why not? Maybe he could just leave. A faint shadow of himself began to play before his eyes. He could imagine it, an older version of himself stepping with confidence through the gates and traveling through the forest. After a while, he'd find another village and be welcomed with open arms and to the sound of cheers and maybe he'd even find other people there with red hair and whiskers on their faces, and with a loud resounding sound, Naruto slapped his hands on his face. Furiously, he shook his head. He was being stupid. He was an orphan. He didn't have any family members elsewhere, his caretaker had made that clear enough. And if he was this hated in his own village, when he'd done nothing, what were the chances of his being accepted anywhere else? Turning his back on the sun, Naruto let his face cool in the darkness. While it had sounded like a great idea, maybe leaving the village wasn't the answer. But if that wasn't, then what was? Was there anything else he could do? Sometimes, he wondered what it was like to walk outside in the sun without being jeered at. It would be nice, he thought, to not have to wear his scarf. And sometimes, when he saw the other children leaving the playground holding their parents' hands, something throbbed within his chest. The leaves of the trees in the hills had long since turned orange and red, before the answer came to Naruto from a rather unexpected source. On the morning of his 6th birthday, he woke up to find the room cold and with no breakfast on the table. His caretaker had always made him 3 meals a day, washed the dishes after him, done his laundry, and cleaned his small apartment once a week. She'd never had a kind word for him, in fact, she'd rarely spoke to him at all, but she'd never made him starve before. Blearily staring at the empty table as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, Naruto didn't notice the masked individual that suddenly appeared on the open windowsill. Before he could do much else, the man had forcefully picked him up and jumped out the window. At first, thinking that someone had finally decided to attack him in his home, he struggled in the strange man's grip, clawing at the man's chest. But he then realized that the man was wearing a porcelain animal mask and metal chest armor, and relaxed. As much as he was hated by the rest of the village, it was common knowledge that the strange animal mask men worked for the Hokage. Sure enough, he was dumped unceremoniously into the Hokage's office. Naruto didn't remember ever having been in here before, but he could read the characters, Hokage, on the desk in the middle, which's top was overflowing with stacks of paper and scrolls. The Hokage himself stood before him. His aged countenance and wizened form almost belied the strong, unwavering eyes that observed him from below the white hat. Naruto quivered and began to look away, but unlike the villagers, the Hokage's gaze held no animosity or hatred. So he met the elder ninja's dark eyes with his own, and for a moment, he thought he might have seen a flicker of emotion within them. But then it was gone, and he turned away. Naruto learned several things that day. Though he'd never really thought about it before, he now learned that the Hokage had been his benefactor paying for his caretaker, and that now that he was 6, she would no longer be coming by. He would receive a monthly stipend from the Hokage, but he would have to prepare his own meals and clean up after himself. And finally, he learned that he was to attend the academy, starting immediately. Running as fast as his legs could carry him back to his apartment, Naruto was so excited that for once, he didn't even notice the glaring that followed him. After all, the academy was the holy grail for the children at the playground. Having a sibling in it gave you automatic bragging rights, and if you were going to be joining it yourself, uncontested rights to the best swing, bar nothing. For the first time in his life, he felt a rising airy sensation in his chest that he didn't know the word for. However, that evening, Naruto watched the sun set from his window, and with the growing darkness, he began to feel a niggling sense of doubt. He'd never been allowed to join or be a part of anything before. Would attending the academy really change anything for him? He'd always admired the ninja, their mystique and power made them just like the heroes of his childhood folk tales. But could he become like one of them? And if he did, would people stop hating him? Or was he doomed to be hated for the rest of his life? His fingers, rested on the windowsill, clenched into his palms, leaving behind red marks. No, Naruto decided. None of that mattered. He would just become a ninja that they couldn't ignore or despise. He would become so great, his red hair or his whisker marks wouldn't matter. Whether they thought he was ugly or stupid, none of that would matter. He would become the most revered and respected ninja of Konoha. He would become Hokage. Even if he couldn't own their bodies or their minds, he vowed, he would own their hearts. Chapter 2. Loneliness. The next morning found Naruto scanning his own appearance before the mirror. If he was going to become Hokage, he knew he should at least have the ability to make a good first impression on his teacher and his classmates. Thankfully, his caretaker had at least done the laundry before she left. Now, he was wearing his best, or rather, least threadbare clothes. His hair, on the other hand, was a completely different story. It was a spiky red mane that hung down to his neck. Rolling a lock of the bright hair between his fingers, Naruto wondered if he should trim it. He glanced out his window, and let go of the lock. He could see the Hokage monument from his apartment, and if the busts were accurate, the second, third, and fourth had all had rather crazy spiky hair. Clearly, their hair hadn't impeded their rise to the top, and he figured that his wouldn't either. In fact, he thought in a passing way, the fourth's hair even rather resembled his own. Nevertheless, he dug out a brush that hadn't seen the light of day since it had been bought, and dutifully tugged it through his hair. Finally, with one last check in the mirror, smoothing out a non-existent crease in his shirt, he left his apartment and headed to the academy. Before he entered the building, Naruto paused and looked up at the circular sign that proudly hung in the niche above the doors. The character for Shinobi was emblazoned on it in bold ink, and he knew enough to know that it was made up by the separate characters of Blade and Heart. Together, it meant endure. It seemed appropriate considering the goal that he had in mind. Tracing the character with a finger on his palm, he took a deep breath and stepped through the doors. The classroom was large with a high ceiling, and filled with rows of desks, stacked in an increasing, rising order like a staircase. When Naruto walked in, following his new instructor, a man with an old scar across his face who had introduced himself as Yumi no Iruka, a palpable ripple of surprise swept through the room. The noise level in the class sharply dropped, as dozens of pairs of eyes turned to observe him. Naruto didn't meet any of their narrowed gazes, but stood awkwardly in front of the blackboard. Offhandedly, he realized that he recognized one of the faces that stared back at him. It belonged to the girl with the large forehead who he'd noticed getting picked on a few times in the playground. "This is Uzumaki Naruto," Iruka introduced in a ringing voice. At the sound of his name, some of the children began to whisper amongst themselves. He's 6 years old, and he'll be joining our class from today onwards, so make him feel welcome. I hope we can be friends, said Naruto, forcing the tips of his lips up into a smile. He'd never had much of a reason to make one before, but he had observed from afar how smiles could lower people's guards. He thought he heard some snickers and maybe even a muttered, "tomato head," but for the most part, the children only stared back at him sullenly. Considering his introduction largely a success, Naruto found an empty seat next to another boy with a dark countenance, who idly rested his head on his hand. It turned out that the class had been going over how to read and write several basic characters that he already knew, so for the first hour, Naruto had the unhindered liberty of observing his new instructor. Iruka had seemed courteous enough when he first introduced himself outside of the classroom, but he wondered what the Chunin truly thought of him. Iruka certainly seemed jumpy about him. In the last 10 minutes alone, his eyes had flickered 4 times over to where Naruto was sitting, and he had stumbled over his words each time. Judging by the sheen of his face, the man was sweating slightly as well, and Naruto had learned from first-hand experience that, if it wasn't from the heat, it indicated they were nervous. From his brief personal interaction with the instructor, Naruto could already tell that Iruka was usually a proficient teacher. Discreetly looking around, every time Iruka fumbled over a sentence, he saw looks of puzzlement reflected on the faces of his classmates, confirming the fact. He returned his gaze to the Chunin just as the man in question looked up at Naruto, and their eyes met for a split second. Iruka gave no visible signs of reacting, and looked away almost immediately, mistakenly writing a different character on the blackboard as he did so. But Naruto already knew. Though it was just the smallest glimmer, he had seen that same, strange look of fear and revulsion that everyone else in the village had whenever they saw him. His spirits beginning to sink, he wondered whether he would be kicked out of the academy after all. After the lesson on reading and writing, the class moved on to chakra, and suddenly, Naruto found himself out of his depth. Apparently, there was something called a chakra point, and a person had 361 of them. There was also something called hand seals, and the 12 basic ones were named after the horoscope animals. But not knowing what chakra itself actually was, Naruto could barely follow the discussion, let alone participate. From the sounds of it, it sounded like magic, but he'd always thought magic was mere fantasy. So what else could it be? An hour of torture later, the class was over, and the students were given a short lunch break. As most of the other children filed out of the room, Naruto dawdled at his desk before approaching the instructor, who was flipping through a sheaf of papers on a clipboard. "Iruka-sensei," Naruto began in a low voice, looking down at the ground. Most adults didn't like it when he looked at them directly. "Yes, Naruto." He heard the rustle of paper above him. Iruka's tone was casual, but Naruto thought he could detect a note of tension. "Could you tell me what chakra is?" When the man didn't answer right away, Naruto looked up and hurriedly added, "The discussion was very interesting, and I wanted to join in, but I'm still not sure what it is, and where it comes from." To his relief, Naruto observed some of the tension leave the instructor's face, though he still looked perplexed. "Well, Naruto, chakra is a form of energy that all living things have. The energy is a mold of physical and spiritual, and goes around your body in a network. We ninjas can use this chakra to perform techniques." Iruka paused, before adding, "Do you know what a technique is?" Naruto shook his head no. A technique is a skill made possibly by chakra, with effects like walking on water, exhaling fire, and creating illusions. There are all kinds of techniques, such as ninjutsu, genjutsu, taijutsu, and even the most basic one requires you to mold your chakra. Usually, techniques require a certain sequence of hand seals. To demonstrate, he put his 2 hands together and quickly made some signs. There was a burst of smoke, and suddenly, someone who looked exactly like Naruto was standing in front of him. Letting out a small exclamation of amazement, he stepped back. There was another burst of smoke, and Iruka was standing before him again. That was the transformation technique. It's one of the most basic ninjutsu techniques, and we'll be learning it when your class is a bit more advanced. Eagerly, Naruto put his hands together and mimicked the man's hand signs. To his disappointment, nothing happened. "Just doing the motions won't be enough, I'm afraid," said Iruka with a smile. Naruto's eyes widened at the sight, and the smile slid off of the man's face like sap. He coughed. "Well, off you go now." Naruto left with his heart pounding. He couldn't remember anyone having ever smiled at him before. And unlike the smile he himself had given the class, this hadn't been an offering of goodwill, it had been the genuine article. Feeling like a large burden had been removed from his shoulders, Naruto began to wander the village, looking for a place to eat that wouldn't chase him out. So long as he didn't get on Iruka's bad side, maybe he would be able to learn everything he wanted about being a ninja. And then, he would be that much closer to becoming the Hokage. As Naruto passed by a small restaurant, a ninja with a face mask stepped out from under its flap. As the flap dropped down, the most hauntingly delicious aroma he had ever smelled came wafting out, freezing him in place. There was a big paper lantern hanging outside. It said, Ramen Ichiraku, in bold red characters. As though entranced, before he knew it, he had lifted the flap and stepped in. Several of the villagers were already there, eating, and at his entry they looked up at him. Reacting on instinct, Naruto tensed, waiting for them to glare at him, but instead, their faces grew pale. Rising to their feet with a clatter, they all left in a hurry, leaving behind an array of empty stools. Well, that was a new reaction, even he'd never cleared a restaurant out like that before. Feeling a chill run down his back, Naruto turned to the counter to find himself face to face with a stern-faced man in an apron. He waited for him to respond angrily, but instead, the man grunted, "What'll you have?" Taken aback, Naruto's eyes flickered over to the menu and he stammered out the first item he saw, miso ramen. Less than 10 minutes later, the most majestic bowl of noodles he had ever seen in his life was placed in front of him. Slowly, he raised his chopsticks to his mouth, and as warmth spread through his body, his chopsticks picked up in pace, and soon he was inhaling the rest of the bowl. It was not to last, however. Hearing the stools beside him clattering once more, he looked up, and almost choked on a noodle. They were a rowdy group of children he recognized from his class at the academy. Hunching over his bowl, he tried to shrink in on himself. But without his scarf, there was nothing to hide his hair. "Well, what do you know? Hey look everyone, it's Tomato Head," said one of the boys, jumping up from his seat. His friends joined him, and they rapidly spread out around Naruto to surround him. He said stiffly, "My name is Naruto." "What was the Tomato Head?" the boy said in a loud voice, cupping his ear as if he hadn't been able to hear him. When Naruto didn't respond, he dropped his hand and glanced over at his sniggering friends. "Nogi here says she heard you asking Iruka-sensei about what chakra is." "Yay, sensei couldn't believe it," chortled a pudgy girl. "He told us after you left that you didn't know nothing and that," she sniffed, "we should help you out." "Ah, does little baby need his diapers changed?" the boy crowed. He leaned over and swiped Naruto's bowl. "Does Tomato Head want his mommy?" "Oh wait." He laughed and lifted the bowl to his lips. "You don't have one." Blinking, Naruto watched the bully slurp up the remainder of his ramen. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that the owner of the restaurant was preoccupied with another customer. "It's not nice to make fun of people about their parents," he finally said in a mild tone that belied the increasingly hot fire that burned in his belly. "What would you know about being nice? It's not like you ever had parents to teach you," scoffed a girl. "My parents told me to stay away from you, 'cause you're bad," added the boy with relish. "I'm not bad," gasped Naruto before he could stop himself. "You are too." "No I'm not." "Are too." "I'm not." "Are too." "Damn Tomato Head. No one wants you here." The boy lifted his hand up with the bowl still in hand. Not comprehending, Naruto watched dumbly as the bowl flew through the air and hit him on the chest with a crash, spilling cold liquid all over his best clothes. "Hey!" The owner had finally noticed what was going on, but at the sound of his voice, the children all scrambled out, the restaurant's flaps swinging emptily in their wake. Naruto stood frozen for a second, watching with wide eyes the oily liquid drip from the ends of his hair. There was a big black splotch now on his favorite orange shirt that he knew would never come out. Regaining control of his body, he slowly bent over to pick up the bowl, which had thankfully not cracked. Placing it back on the counter, he hesitantly peeked up. The owner stared down at him with a twisted look he didn't understand, and flinching, he apologized, before lowering his head back down again. Putting some coins down on the counter, he left. Not daring to lift his head back up, he raced back to his home. Though no voices called out to him, the whole, long way back, he thought he could feel glares burning into his back. Once he was home, Naruto robotically began to pull out some of his more worn spare clothes from the closet. All he could think about was how he had to quickly change and return to the academy before the lunch break was over, or else he would get in trouble on his first day. If he was to become a great Hokage, he couldn't get kicked out. It was only when he was zipping down his ruined hoodie that he noticed that his fingers were trembling. And then, as he wondered why they were doing that, he also realized that he had lost all strength in his legs. Letting out a small, "oh," he fell down on his knees in the dark room. Automatically hunching over on his hands, Naruto felt something warm and wet streak down the sides of his face and land with a plop on the floor. In a detached sort of way, he realized with surprise that he was crying. He had observed before, from afar, people crying for a variety of reasons. Sometimes, people, mostly children, cried when they weren't getting their way. Once, he'd seen a girl about his age burst into tears when her mother refused to buy her a stick of candy, and observed how the mother had given in. When he experimentally asked his caretaker to buy him a stick of candy, she'd wordlessly stared at him coldly, as though looking at a particularly disgusting insect on the backside of her sandal. He'd never asked her for anything again after that. Most of the time, however, people cried because they were in pain or because they were sad. When a child fell over in the playground and began to cry, their mother or father would frantically look up at the sound of their voice, and run over. When they saw that the child had only scraped a knee, they would laugh in relief and place a band-aid over their injury. Then the child would feel magically better and go back to playing with their friends. As he wondered which emotion he was feeling, Naruto began to feel even more strange. There was a hazy sensation creeping up his body and taking over. And then suddenly, against his will, he collapsed down completely with his face pressed against the ground. Someone was making a terrible moaning sound, and for several seconds, he listened in alarm as he looked for its source, before realizing that it was coming from himself. A mixture of snot and tears was streaming down his face, and he began to worry about how he couldn't go back to the academy with a splotchy face when suddenly, he realized that he didn't care. He wasn't sure what this heaviness in his chest was, but he didn't want to feel it anymore. And if crying would help him lessen it, he would do it. After all, no one was there to hear him. If he wanted to become a strong ninja, he knew he could never let anyone else see him crying, because the heroes in his book had never cried, but right now, he was alone in this cold, dark room. Just this once, he thought, eyes squeezed shut and tears dripping from his nose. A cold and detached part of Naruto thought that he should be pleased to have this privacy. But at the same time, he had never felt so alone before. He felt like he was the only person in the world. Chapter 3. Dream and Determination. And the winner is Sasuke. As the watching students cheered, Naruto, lying flat on his back, looked up at the sky. It was a nice day, he thought, with only a few clouds in the sky. After a few seconds passed, dredging up the last of his willpower, he clambered up to his feet, ignoring how sore his body felt. Brushing the dirt off of his pants, he walked to the edge of the wooden platform and leapt heavily down. The next bout will be between Sakura and Ino. He heard Iruka call out, and two squabbling girls jumped up to the platform. Nice one, Naruto, a boy called out. Without responding, Naruto passed him by, but not before he heard the boy add, "You lasted almost 10 seconds up there." The children standing near them laughed, and feeling the tips of his ears beginning to burn, Naruto abruptly picked up pace and ran back inside the academy building. His footsteps pounded loudly through the hallway, and even though he knew he should be practicing how to run without making a sound, he couldn't bring himself to care. The door to his classroom opened with a clatter, and straining on his tiptoes, he grabbed his bag from his cubby near the end. Naruto knew it was wrong to leave when academy wasn't even over, but the only thing they were doing for the rest of the day was the one-on-one taijutsu fights. No one would notice him gone, except maybe Nogi and her friends, anyways. Just as he neared the open doors to the front exit, Naruto heard the sound of adult conversation, and skidded to a halt. His heart pounding in his ears, he looked right and left, looking for a place to hide. As the sound grew closer and closer, he chose the first thing he'd noticed, dashing into the niche between the door and the wall. The students coming along. They're very promising. We're conducting this year's first taijutsu tournament today, and they're all performing excellently. Naruto's eyes widened, as he recognized Iruka's voice. Hadn't he just been back at the arena? What was he doing here now? Had he noticed Naruto was gone? Unable to put aside his rising curiosity, he put an eye to the crack of the door, and then seeing the person beside Iruka, he felt his heart skip a beat. The Hokage was standing right in front of the very door he was now quivering behind. Ah, Fugaku's younger son is in your class, no. Quite precocious, isn't he? Actually, while I'd hate to see him go, I think that if he continues to perform as well as he is doing now, transferring him to a more advanced class wouldn't be out of the question. They are brothers after all, the Hokage chuckled. There was a short pause, as the Hokage seemed to be surveying the academy building. For a horrifying instant, Naruto thought that the elderly ninja's gaze had paused on the sliver of his face, and had to fight the urge to run. But then he turned away, and Naruto felt some of the feeling begin to return to his face. They resumed talking, but began to move away in the direction of where the other children were, and after a short while, Naruto finally came out from his hiding spot. His head turning back and forth rapidly to survey the empty lot, Naruto ran as fast as he could, only coming to a stop when he reached the cover of a patch of trees. Panting, he rested for a few minutes against the trunk of a cherry blossom tree. 2 weeks had passed since he'd joined the academy, and Naruto had quickly learned that it wasn't just basic ninja knowledge that he was behind in. Many of the other students were from clans or had ninja relatives, and they had been training since well before joining the academy. It was all Naruto could do to keep up with the daily physical exercise, and he was completely out of his depth when it came to actual taijutsu. While the other children were flipping through the air and flowing from one stance to the next, Naruto was still struggling to follow along without landing flat on his back. He desperately needed more instruction, but Iruka only had so much time to spend on him before he had to move on to the other children. Iruka had told Naruto and the few others who hadn't ever received training before that they would catch up soon, but lately, he hadn't been able to bring himself to even look up at the academy sign. He'd sworn to become Hokage, but the way he was now, he thought he'd be lucky to even graduate. If only, Naruto thought. If only he had someone outside of the academy to teach him. Then maybe he wouldn't be so behind. He shook his head wildly. Jumping up to his feet, Naruto smacked his cheeks with his hands. If he had time to feel sorry for himself, he thought, he might as well spend it practicing. Drawing himself up to his full height, he turned to face the tree he had been leaning against. Emptying his mind, he felt his body relax. Adjusting his footing and planting them firmly into the ground, he curled his hands into fists the way he'd learned in class, and then he punched his right fist into the empty air. Then, drawing that one back, he punched with his left fist. Right, left, left. Over and over, Naruto punched repeatedly into the air, pushing his body to remember the motion, until suddenly, he realized with a jolt, that several hours had passed, the sun had set, and the temperature had dropped. He was rummaging through the bushes looking for his bag, when he heard the sound of footsteps and froze. Reacting on instinct, for the second time that day, Naruto ducked, trusting the shadows to complete his concealment. To his dismay, the footsteps stopped at a place not too far from where he was hiding. This looks like a great place to talk, doesn't it, Izumo? It was Iruka again, and compulsively, Naruto stepped back even further into the bush's shadow. Sure. It was an unfamiliar male voice this time. What did you want me for? I was just thinking, it's a pity the Konoha Archive Library is closed to civilians, isn't it? What? Of course it is. We wouldn't want sensitive village information falling into the hands of just anybody. But it's not just that, right? There's the jutsu section, with scrolls on taijutsu, genjutsu, ninjutsu. Well, yes. But civilians would just hurt themselves without formal instruction. But if that section was open to, say, academy students, that'd help them with their studies, don't you think? Are you feeling okay, Iruka? The voice sounded annoyed. Of course it's open to academy students. Not that my little sister seems to care. Oh yes, I forgot. They'll need an academy instructor's permission for more advanced level scrolls, but basic and fundamental scrolls are freely accessible to students. The Konoha Archive Library sure comes in handy. Don't you agree, Izumo? What in the... Wait, this is Katetsu, isn't it? Said the other voice suspiciously. Was that supposed to be your impression of Iruka? I'm right, aren't I? Yeah, you caught me. Absolutely terrible, man. I'm a bit rusty, I suppose. Rusty. That doesn't even cover it. Iruka doesn't stomp around like that, he kinda walks with his hips moving like this. There was a rustling sound. Like this. Yeah, exactly. Spot on. See, you can do this. The voices faded away. After a few minutes, his heart still thudding in his chest, Naruto finally jumped out. It had been nerve-wracking hiding the whole time, but he couldn't believe his luck at coming across such a vital piece of information, the library. That was it. His mind racing with the possibilities, Naruto rushed home. If he had stopped even for a minute to retrace his footsteps, he may have found the conversation rather odd, as though performed for his benefit rather than a truly organic dialogue. Instead, he turned in for the night extra early, practically flying under his bedcovers in his excitement. As tends to happen, however, he found himself watching the glow of his alarm clock for half the night, willing time to speed up a whole while, and when he finally woke up the next morning, not having even realized when he had fallen asleep, he bustled around his apartment getting ready, with more energy than he'd had the entire past week combined. That day's academy lesson was thankfully conducted indoors, with a primary focus on reading, writing and math, and as soon as classes were over, Naruto was the first one out the door. He'd seen and passed by the entrance to the archive library before, of course, it was near his home, built right under the Hokage monument. But the sign had always looked so official, and the long doors too foreboding. Climbing up the stone stairway, he hesitated before the entrance. Reaching out with a hand, he pushed the doors, and despite their size, they opened silently. Inside, a bored-looking Chunin was sitting behind a black counter, and beyond that, Naruto felt his eyes widen as he saw a huge expanse of bookshelves, with tomes and scrolls crammed into every open space from top to bottom. There was even another stairway that led downstairs, to a whole other floor of bookshelves that stretched from wall to wall. Pass, the Chunin grunted, not looking up from the book in his hand. Naruto froze. His hands tightening over the strap of his bag, he looked down at his toes, wondering if he'd misheard Iruka, or Katetsu, he supposed. He started out. At the sound of his voice, the Chunin looked up, and as recognition flitted across his face, for a second, Naruto thought he was going to yell at him to get out. But to his surprise, the Chunin put down his book and scribbled something on a piece of paper, before ripping it out and giving it to him. "Here's your academy student pass," he said. Naruto hesitantly reached for it, wondering wildly whether the Chunin would snatch it back at the last second with a sneer. But his fingers wrapped around the paper, and the Chunin let go. He returned to his book. Slowly, Naruto turned around, looking out once more at the bookshelves. "First floor only," the Chunin added in his bored voice. Nodding, Naruto shot off before the Chunin could take back the pass. With his head wrapped in his scarf, he'd sneaked a few times into the public library before, but that had held nowhere near the amount of scrolls and books that he saw here. And it was far quieter here. There weren't any bored, mischievous children parked here by their parents, or feeble old women yelling at the librarian that their dog was missing. Naruto came to a stop before a bookshelf marked Academy Level, and craning his head back to scan the labels on the scrolls, he let out a slow breath. He'd learned the characters for taijutsu, ninjutsu, and genjutsu just a few days ago, and they were all here. Spotting a stool nearby, he dragged it over and climbed on top. On the very first shelf, the very first scroll was taijutsu for beginners. Naruto reached out and pulling it out, was surprised to feel how heavy it was. Gingerly, he unfurled the thick paper, and let out another shaking breath at the sight of the detailed illustrations. His gaze raced from each stance to the next, taking note of each individual adjustment of the feet and hands. Naruto began to shake, and not trusting himself, he carefully rolled the scroll back up. His eyes felt hot, and he had to remind himself that ninja didn't cry. But it took all the willpower he had to force back the tears, and only when his eyes were completely dry did he allow himself to open the scroll up again. He knew, now, these scrolls would be his teachers, his parents, his friends. 1 year later, the next bout will be between Naruto and Nogi. A girl wearing her hair back in a ponytail stepped out nervously onto the wooden platform. The platform, which had been smooth and unblemished at the beginning of the year, was now scarred with numerous marks of past fights, serving as a reminder of how far they had come since then. Opposite her, a young boy with red hair leapt lightly onto the platform, making only the slightest sound as he landed. He stood relaxed and comfortably, with his hands hanging in front of him. His name was Uzumaki Naruto. Nogi hated him. At first, it had been fun just because he was so easy to make fun of with his stupid hair, and she never got in trouble for picking on him, because nobody else liked him either. When her papa came home late smelling of beer and yelled at her mama and told Nogi to pick up her damn toys, there was nothing that made her feel better than running outside and taunting him with Funa and Yasu. Naruto never said anything back, but he never cried either, so it was easy to pretend that he wasn't, well, one of them. He was weak too. Nogi always relished her matchups against him in taijutsu, and always used extra force than necessary when pushing him down to the ground, even though she always got in trouble with Iruka. But gradually, at some point over the year, Nogi had suddenly found that he wasn't quite so easy to push down anymore. His awkward movements at the beginning of the year were gone, and one day, he even managed to connect a kick. It was stronger than she'd expected, and she was sent flying off the platform. Her friends were immediately at her side helping her up, but when she looked up, Naruto was already getting off the platform, without a second glance at her. Nogi hated him. It was now the end of the year taijutsu evaluation. She lowered into her preferred starting stance, a compact and defensive one that still gave her enough maneuverability to jab out and go on the offensive in an instant. She hadn't fought against Naruto since he'd kicked her, but she knew that she couldn't underestimate him anymore. The only one who seemed to be able to knock down the boy nowadays was Sasuke, and well, nobody beat Sasuke. Begin. Nogi tensed up, readying herself. But to her annoyance, Naruto didn't move. He just stood there, watching her with a blank look on his face, and after a few seconds, she couldn't hold it in anymore. His red hair taunted her, filling her with anger, and she charged at him. Her hands were outstretched, and she threw herself forward, when he stepped aside. She felt something smash down on her back, and grunting in pain, she fell flat on her face. Before she could get back on her feet, she felt Naruto kick down on her side and shove her off the platform. She landed roughly with a loud thud, and coughed as a cloud of dirt erupted around her. The winner is Naruto. Nogi forced her sore body to turn around, and seeing Naruto's back as he walked off the platform, she felt hot tears begin to form in her eyes. She really hated him. After the year's evaluation, when Iruka took Naruto aside and asked whether he wanted to be transferred to an upper-level class, he answered, yes, without a second's hesitation. Instead of being in the top of his class, as he was now, he would probably have to return to being in the bottom-most rung again. But Naruto didn't mind. He knew that with patience and hard work, his teachers would guide him once more. I'm glad it worked out, was Iruka's last remark to Naruto, though he didn't quite understand what the chunin meant. That winter, Naruto spent even more time in the archives than before, determined to get an early start on his studies. And finally, when springtime came and the academy opened again, he found himself standing before yet another class of strange faces that looked back at him with sullen eyes. Steeling himself with a blank look, he prepared himself for yet another year of insufferable snickering and taunting. However, to his surprise, his new classmates were slightly different. They were older than him, being 9 or 10 years old, and he found that to some extent, they had grown out of the ignorant cruelty of their childhood. They were at the age when they began to think for themselves instead of blindly following what their parents told them to. But at the same time, nobody approached him. Naruto wasn't an outsider, but he wasn't one of them. He was just something that sat beside them in their classroom and sparred with them outside. Well, that was fine with Naruto. He'd gotten along just fine without any friends in his first class, and the newfound peace in his current class was more than enough for him. He had his teachers in the archives. They taught him and kept him company. And even more than that, they were his friends, and Naruto didn't have to hide anything from them. Naruto had 2 secrets that he'd never told anyone else. The first was that he felt 2 types of chakra running through his body. Of course he couldn't see any of it, but if he had to describe them in terms of how they felt, he'd say the first one felt yellow, and that the second felt red. He had never tried directly using the second chakra. He'd found out early on that so long as he focused on his yellow chakra, he could easily direct it to gather wherever he wanted. The red chakra was much wilder and much more stubborn, and sometimes disrupted his chakra, making his ninjutsu fail. After some deliberation and several headaches, he had put aside his red chakra, focusing instead on controlling his yellow chakra. The second secret was that when he nudged his red chakra, a curious black seal appeared on his abdomen. It looked similar to the symbol on the shoulders of the ninja uniform, with squiggly lines coming out like the rays of a sun, but there wasn't much more Naruto could decipher about it. After all, in the academy, they hadn't learned anything beyond the bare bones of fuinjutsu, let alone anything about putting seals on a person. The implications of there being a seal on his body were initially chilling. Why was it there? Who had put it there? And what was it sealing? Was it perhaps the source of his red chakra? To his disappointment, there was nothing useful on the subject of advanced fuinjutsu in the archives, and when he tried to reason it out in his mind, all it did was give him a headache. Thinking about it rationally, Naruto would have expected himself to do everything that he could to figure out the seal. And yet, strangely enough, he felt no compulsion to do so. On the contrary, he found the topic of the seal even slipping from his mind, sometimes to the point that he had to stop and think about what he was looking for in the archives. It was a strange thing. But aside from the occasional headache, it didn't seem to affect him in any tangibly negative manner, nor was there anyone he could have asked about it in the first place. In the end, after several weeks of frustration, he put it aside for good and stopped thinking about it at all. And so, the months passed. Every morning, Naruto woke up early and, after his routine sets of push-ups and pull-ups, as recommended by a body training scroll, he practiced building up chakra by walking up the walls of his apartment. He also began to spend his mornings meditating and concentrating on feeling the flow of his chakra running through his body. It was hard to believe that there had once been a time when he didn't know what chakra was. It was the spirit of his very self circulating throughout his body. In the afternoons, Naruto attended the academy and learned about chakra and hand seals, mastering basic techniques. He studied how to set traps, how to disguise his own presence, and how to eliminate as much sound as possible from his movements. He learned how to detonate explosive tags remotely with chakra, and could release himself from all basic genjutsu. He was smaller than everyone else in his class, so he didn't win quite as easily as he had before, but he made sure none of his losses were in vain. Instead, he learned how to weave in and out to confuse your opponent, and how to use his opponent's movements and body weight against them. And in the evenings, Naruto hurried to meet his teachers and friends in the archive library. In return for his loyalty, they granted to him their secrets, teaching him the lore of how jutsu worked, of how one used hand seals to manipulate how much chakra one used to fuel a technique. He learned that while the academy taught them the traditional way to use seals and jutsu, a true master of ninjutsu could perform a complex jutsu with just a single hand seal. Naruto had become such a frequent visitor at the archives, that eventually, the Chunin had stopped paying such close attention to him. He didn't want to lose their trust, but sometimes when he thought it was safe, he slipped out of the academy section and went into the higher-level jutsu shelves. It was there that he discovered that a technique called the Kage Bunshin shadow clone technique existed, which its usefulness far outstripped that of the simpler version they learned in the academy. Determined to master it, he slipped it back with him into the academy section. Then, he quickly read through the instructions, hiding it behind a scroll about the applications of water jutsu in agriculture. Reading through it, it became readily apparent as to the reason why they didn't teach it at the academy. Unlike the illusionary clones, the shadow clones took up substantially more chakra. It was an amount that the typical person couldn't afford to expend. However, in his experimentations with his different types of chakra, Naruto had come to realize that his chakra reserves far exceeded that of any ordinary ninja's levels. And so, with extensive practice in the forest, he was eventually able to successfully summon several shadow clones. Chapter 10. Dark clouds approach. When Naruto opened his eyes, he was momentarily disoriented by the glowing blue lights around him before he remembered where he was. They were somewhere deep under Sunagakuer, in the midst of the maze of the second test. They had figured out how to get water, food, and had found shelter for the night. Now, they would have to decide how to fulfill the second set of requirements of the exam, obtaining another team's number plate while protecting their own. As he grew more alert, he was shaken out of his thoughts when his nose picked up the aroma of roasting meat wafted through the air. His stomach growled, and he got up, sniffing the air. Turning around, he saw Mayu sitting beside a small makeshift campfire. From the looks of it, she had prepared breakfast as they slept. Much of the color in her face had returned, and judging from the small smile on her face, she certainly felt better. She was currently turning several stone sticks skewered through meat and what looked like yellow vegetables over the flickering fire. Naruto sat down on the ground beside Rai, who gave him a nod but otherwise, to his relief, made no indication of the conversation they had shared the previous night. Instead, sharing identical looks of gratitude as Mayu offered them their portions, they dug in. It was quiet for several minutes as they ate, watching the shadow of their fire dancing on the moss-covered walls. Finally, Rai spoke up. Now that we're rested and all, he viciously tore a chunk of meat off of his stick. Ish time to shake oath some rootkis, yeah. Mayu frowned. That's disgusting. Rolling his eyes, Rai began to chew even more noisily than before. Ignoring them, Naruto decided to dive straight into business. It's been about 13 hours since the test began, leaving us with just under 110 hours. We can either wait for the last 2 days, or strike fast and finish early. If we wait it out, it's likely that we'll get our choose of the pickings among the weaker teams still remaining. But the ones who still haven't passed at that point might be more desperate, more dangerous, Mayu pointed out, her pink face tinged with worry. And on top of capturing another plate, we also have to start thinking about reaching the surface, right? Trailing off, she turned to Naruto searchingly. It hadn't escaped his notice how Mayu had begun to speak up in their discussions. It was a welcome change to the wall he'd once felt like he was talking at. Desperation breeds desperate measures, he said. So we should try and finish this quickly and early. And like you said, Mayu's face brightened, it'll be best to start mapping out the maze while keeping an eye out for enemy teams and booby traps. Every time the tunnels diverge, we'll mark the path we took, and if we come across it again we'll take the other path. Sweeping sand over their campfire, they quickly concealed all signs of their overnight presence. Working under the assumption that Neji would have used his Byakugan to choose the best possible route, they then left the blue cavern through the same tunnel Naruto had seen the rookies go through the day before. As the dimly lit pathway rapidly decreased in diameter, they were forced to walk closer together. Naruto felt Mayu shudder, and picked up their pace. Soon, however, they stopped, as the tunnel forked into two different paths, one widened out and sloped upwards, while the other narrowed and sloped downwards. So, which one will it be? Said Rai, eyeing the two paths. Mayu wordlessly edged towards the wider path, making her preference obvious. Yeah, but that's exactly what they'd expect us to take, right? Without responding, Naruto positioned himself directly in the middle of the fork and closed his eyes. He raised both of his arms, and then a moment later, opened his eyes. He began to head down the wider path, and motioned for his teammates to follow him. I can feel a slight breeze coming from this path, he explained when he saw the questioning looks on their faces. The air from the other side is still, so it's likely a dead end. They shared bemused looks but trusted his judgment. However, while they navigated through the tunnels of the underground maze, they were forced to resort to a wide variety of tactics. Mayu sent out her bluebirds ahead of them, and they provided a constant stream of information, which, though limited, was helpful in sketching out their mental map of the caves. Rai kept a sharp eye out for signs of fights and scuffles as well as keeping track of which tunnels they had already went down. Meanwhile, when Naruto wasn't able to discern any difference between the wind currents of a split in the pathway, he sent out a shadow clone down one while they walked down the other. After several hours, during which they made fast progress, Naruto suddenly came to a halt and winced. One of the shadow clones he had sent out 20 minutes ago had just fallen into a pit full of fat larvae before promptly dissipating. Shivering at the sensation of crawling all over his body, he narrowly almost missed the extra shadow that flickered behind them. Without reacting or changing his expression, Naruto began to walk again. Raising his hand to brush a lock of his hair out of his eyes, he twitched his pinky. Glancing sideways, he made eye contact with Rai, who gave an imperceptible nod. Dramatically making groaning sounds, Rai slumped down on the ground. Man, I'm starving, he complained. It's about time for lunch, isn't it? We've come pretty far, let's find some food now. I agree, said Naruto, crossing his arms. Let's take a break for now. Well, alright then, said Mayu. I'll collect some vegetables, so how about you two get the moles? Sounds good, said Rai, pulling out a kunai and twirling it in his hand. Come on, Naruto. Let's go find some moles. At his last words, he jumped up and disappeared. A moment later, he reappeared at the opposite end of the tunnel, holding his kunai to the neck of a dark-skinned male genin. At the same time, Naruto swiftly threw a shuriken up at the ceiling. The other genin who had been hanging above them, a stocky blonde male, managed to avoid the shuriken as he scuttled down the wall to the ground. Without a look back at his teammate, he fled to the nearest hole and disappeared. Naruto didn't move, watching the hole expectantly. Several seconds later, there was a yelp of shock and pain from the direction the genin had ran to. The sound of something being dragged across rough ground reverberated through the hollow tunnel, and soon, his shadow clone emerged, dragging the unconscious genin behind him by his collar. The shadow clone tossed the body to the ground beside where Rai stood with the other struggling genin. They tied the two genin together against a boulder, and as Mayu searched their bodies for their team plate, Naruto looked around the surrounding tunnels warily. Judging from their hitayate, they were from Tokigakure, but it looked like they were just a two-man team. When he had first detected their presences behind him, he had thought that perhaps their third member was farther behind and acting as backup. But he couldn't detect a third presence anywhere, meaning that their third member was either too far away, or that they had somehow lost their third member. Naruto played with the idea that their third had managed to conceal their presence from him, but he dismissed that almost instantly. Though poorly lit with ample shadows to hide in, these tunnels were far too narrow and cramped for anyone to continuously hide from him for this long. Where's your third? Is he waiting to ambush us, or what? Rai voiced Naruto's thoughts, nudging the Dark One who was still conscious. The genin scowled ferociously, glaring at them through narrowed eyes. Like I tell you, little br. Ow, ow. He broke off as Naruto's shadow clone shoved him down with his foot. Naruto kneeled beside the genin, and looked him directly in the eye. As the genin watched with horror growing in his eyes, he then pressed the tip of his kunai against the inside of the genin's fingernail, putting in just enough pressure to induce pain. First it'll be your fingernails, and then your fingers, that is, unless you talk. Where is your other teammate? Didn't you hear me the first time? The genin spat at his feet. You're not gonna get nothing outta. He broke off and let out a howl of pain as Naruto thrust his kunai up. With a sick popping sound, his nail fell off. Naruto, said Mayu, her face pale. She stepped forward, but Rai held her back. He looked a little green as well, but his jaw was set. That was just a fingernail, said Naruto softly. The genin's eyes widened, tears of pain leaking out. Imagine how much more it would hurt if I did that to a finger. Alright, she's not here, we ditched her, he yelped. We don't know where she is. Naruto stood up. He could tell from his body language that the genin was telling the truth, or at least, believed it. Swinging his kunai up, he hit the head of the genin with its blunt end, knocking him out. The genin's head crumpled down against his chest. He looked up to see Mayu staring at him with wide eyes. Internally, he let out a sigh as he saw something in her face that he hadn't seen in a while, fear. Was that really necessary? She asked. We're ninja, Mayu, snapped Rai. This is what we do. Stop being such a baby. Mayu didn't respond. Instead, she put the hood of her cloak up over her head. Rai grabbed the team plate she had been clutching in her hand, the number 44 was engraved on it. He tossed it into the air, and then grabbed it before tucking it into his pocket. Ha! That was easy. Leaving the trussed-up genin behind them, they silently walked through the dark tunnel while Naruto's shadow clone slunk back into the darkness to trail them. As Naruto watched Mayu stiffly move away from him, he felt his heart sink a little. He didn't feel any remorse for having handled the situation in that way. Torture was a proven and surefire way of quickly retrieving necessary information. But he wondered if he should have held back for Mayu's sake. It was unfortunate that despite her valuable skill of perception, she had always been the least desensitized of the three and the most averse to solutions to situations that required violence. Naruto sometimes questioned whether she was truly suited for the life of a ninja. As someone who clearly didn't have the heart or the stomach for a ninja's work, it was a wonder how she'd come into it in the first place. Not for the first time, he wondered what he would do if Mayu ever got in the way of a mission. So far, it hadn't proved to be much of an issue, but the missions that awaited them in the future could only be filled with more bloodshed. Suddenly, Naruto came to a halt. In one sleek motion, he pulled out his tanto from its sheath as the memories of his shadow clone flooded his mind. It had just been attacked from behind. The last thing it had seen before disappearing was a flash of white. Before he could let out a warning, a high-pitched voice called out from behind them, "Stop right there." Shock flooding his system, Naruto spun around, dropping into an offensive stance. Besides him, his teammates mirrored his actions. However, the genin that they saw remained calm and seemingly defenseless even as she casually walked towards them. She had short, spiky hair and curious orange eyes. Naruto's eyes flickered to the Hitai-8 slung around her right arm. The waterfall symbol of Takigakur stared back at him. That, and judging from the way she was alone, she was likely the third teammate that had been abandoned by the genin they'd captured their plate from. Naruto's grip on the tanto in his hand tightened. His shadow clone hadn't even sensed her coming up behind him. He had thought that was impossible in such a closed space. He could feel it in his bones. Despite her seemingly harmless exterior, his every nerve was screaming that she was dangerous. There was something foreign about the girl that caused a chill to rack his body. Foreign, and yet at the same time, somewhat familiar. But before he could puzzle over it further, his teammates sprung into action beside him. Rai released a barrage of shuriken at the girl, while Mayu's bluebirds shrilled, taking off into the air. Dodging the shuriken, the girl picked up speed and began to run towards them. Jumping up over the birds, her hands blurred as she opened her mouth. Hiden, Rinpogakur no Jutsu, secret, hiding in scale powder technique. Prepared to counter it, Naruto gathered his chakra into his lungs, his hands blurring through the signs. Futon, Daitapa, wind release, great breakthrough. He blew, expelling a strong wind from his lips. However, to his surprise, what came out of her mouth was something powdery that sparkled, lighting up the tunnel around them. Before Naruto could wonder at its purpose, it made itself clear as the powder rapidly brightened into an intense light akin to that of the afternoon sun, sending searing hot pain into his eyeballs. Rai howled in agony beside him, and Naruto shut his eyes reflexively. He heard the wind he had exhaled continue blowing through the tunnel, but it was too late, the powder had done its work. Opening his eyes, he could only see throbbing circles of yellow and orange that threw him off balance. He staggered. Shouldn't have done that, said the girl. Judging from her voice, she was standing right in front of them, and yet, to his growing alarm, Naruto couldn't sense her presence at all. What the hell is this? Rai snarled. The intense white light was gradually dimming, but Naruto could still only make out, at best, several blobs around him. The name's Fu, she said. That was my scale powder technique, but don't worry, the effects aren't permanent. Usually, anyways. Well, I'm just here to get my team plate back. So, which one of you has it? Rai must have given himself away with an involuntary twitch, for the girl immediately pounced on him. Ah, so you do. There was a muffled yelp and a rustle of clothing. Thanks. See ya laters, alligators. There was a pause. Or not. His vision was restored enough now so that he could see a faint shadowy figure bouncing up and running away from them. Rai made to get up, but Naruto held out a hand to stop him. Rai growled in frustration. What is it? Don't, panted Naruto. We're at a disadvantage right now. It'll be easier to obtain another team's plate than to try and attack her, it isn't worth the effort. Rai let out another snarl of anger, spitting on the ground, but sat back down. Damn that girl. Picking up a pebble from the ground, he flung it at the wall. And that Genin bastard. He lied to us. I'm gonna kill him. I don't think he was, said Mayu quietly. They were probably traveling separately. Why the hell would they do that, when she's got the technique? But none of them had an answer for that. Once their vision was finally restored, they began to press forward again. However, Mayu soon stopped them as her birds informed her that there was an impassable pit up ahead, and they turned around. As they silently walked back along the same path, Naruto's mind buzzed over the recent unexpected turn of events. He hadn't taken the exam seriously enough, obviously. The other team's plate had initially been as easy to capture as expected, but they'd barely had time to even look at the number before it had been taken back by that girl. She'd said her name was Fu. He hadn't been able to gauge her offensive ability, but she'd exuded a kind of confidence that only came with years of experience. Naruto had chosen not to follow her, explaining it to his teammates that their time would be better spent hunting down other teams, but he had to wonder, had it been influenced by doubt, by fear, at all? He didn't doubt his own abilities. He believed that in a direct confrontation, he could take the girl down so long as he avoided her strange powder. Nevertheless, something about her unsettled him. With Rai still fuming and Naruto lost in contemplation, Mayu was the first one to spot the obstacle in their path. She let out a small, oh, of surprise, and stopped. Returning to his senses, Naruto peered ahead at the dimly lit path, and saw the two genin they had left behind still tied to the boulder. From the way they were sitting, he could tell that the blonde, the one he had knocked out, was still unconscious. However, the dark-skinned one that Rai had handled was now awake, and glared at them hatefully. A trickle of blood had dried halfway down his face. Did she not see them or something, muttered Rai, walking over and nudging the blonde experimentally with his foot. He turned to the dark-skinned genin. Oi, did your third teammate pass by? That thing's not a teammate of mine, the genin said coolly. Despite his obvious anger, he seemed more level-headed and in control than his teammate. Rai scratched his head. Well, she took your team plate back from us, he confessed. Wouldn't it have been logical for her to have freed you guys while she was at it? Monsters aren't logical. Monster, repeated Naruto. He noticed Mayu stiffening in surprise beside him, but ignored it. What do you mean? The genin looked up directly at Naruto, and for a moment, he thought that the genin wasn't going to respond. Next to him, the blonde genin suddenly twitched, his eyelids fluttering as they struggled to open. He let out a low moan. The genin's features twisted into one of utter loathing, and his eyes burned with a look that Naruto somehow found familiar. She's a Jinchuriki. What's a Jinchuriki? Asked Rai. Just then, the blonde jerked and his eyes snapped open. Looking around wildly, he spotted Naruto standing by with his arms crossed and flinched. Gradually, as he took in the scene, a look of horror began to dawn on his face. She's got a monster sealed inside of her, she's Takigaku's weapon, explained the genin. Upon hearing his teammate, the blonde's head whipped back as though he'd been slapped. Mushimi, what are you doing? He hissed. That's a village secret. And what about the plan? I don't care, the genin, Mushimi, growled. That thing killed my parents before they sealed it away. I want it dead. And I have my doubts about the plan. The blonde's mouth dropped open. I know how you feel. But remember what Haike-sensei said to us about telling anything to outsiders. Do you even realize what you're doing right now? If it means I have to betray our village, so be it. The conviction rang loud and clear in his voice. By monster, what do you mean? Asked Naruto slowly. As Mushimi opened his mouth, the blonde genin struggled in vain to release himself from his bindings. Shut up, Mushimi, a tailed beast. The 7 tails, said Mushimi, glaring up at them. So go tell your village and your Hokage. Go tell them that Takigaku's raising up a weapon, in order to become one of the 5 great villages. Come and destroy it for us. Chapter 11, Confrontation of the Black Shadow, October 10th, the day of Naruto's 8th birthday and every birthday before that, was Memorial Day at Konoha. It was always a cold, dark and somber day, as though the skies themselves were in mourning. The sun hid itself behind its clouds, which loomed heavily and slowly over the village. The villagers, all garbed in black, gathered around the memorial marker for the fallen heroes of the day the 9 tails attacked. Even at the academy, there was always a special history lesson to begin the day for every class. The year before, when Naruto had been in Iruka's class, the Chunin had recounted for them how the shinobi of the village had fought bravely, holding off the 9 tails from the rest of the village as they waited for the 4th to arrive. Then, they had a moment of silence, before they resumed normal class activities. But Naruto had been transferred to a new class 2 years his senior, and he found this year that his new instructor, a Chunin named Mizuki, conducted the lesson rather differently. Glossing cursorily over what the ninja had done, the man seemed to relish in describing the 9 tails in detail. According to him, it was a colossal leviathan and each lashing tail rained destruction on the world every time it was swung. It was an uncontrollable force of nature, with fangs as long as a grown man and eyes that seethed with the burning fires of hell. The 9 tails was a roiling, churning ball of evil, with only one intention in mind, to destroy anything and anyone in its path. A student raised his trembling hand and asked, but the 4th killed it, right sensei? A murmur of uncomfortable agreement spread throughout the classroom. The students had all of course grown up hearing in their bedtime stories about the monster that had terrorized the prior generation, but they'd never had reason to fear it. Because always, at the end of every story, their mother or father had finished the story by saying, the 4th Hokage, a hero who loved his village and who was loved by the village, was able to protect us. At the cost of his life, he defeated the 9 tails so that the future generation, so that you, could in turn grow up to be fine shinobi and continue protecting Konoha. With a kiss to their forehead, and a click as the light turned off, they had always fallen asleep with smiles on their faces and dreams of becoming the next hero to save their village. But a strange, sly smile stretched across Mizuki-sensei's face as he heard the student's question. Well, he said, the 4th certainly dealt with it for us. And that is why he is today a hero. The Chunin bowed his head downwards in a show of respect, and all the students automatically copied his gesture. However, just before Naruto obediently complied, Mizuki tilted his head and glanced in his direction. And for a moment, Naruto thought that the Chunin's eyes had lingered on him with a cold glint. But an instant later Mizuki's gaze moved on to look fondly over the students. After a moment's hesitation, Naruto thought it more likely the fault of his overactive paranoia. Mizuki-sensei had treated him fairly over the past year, and seemed to bear no ill will against him. It wouldn't do for him to poison the opinion of his instructor, when he had so little support as it was. As he lowered his head, Naruto wondered briefly what Mizuki-sensei had meant by dealt. He hadn't directly answered the student's question. Could that mean that the 9 tails was still alive and roaming the wilderness? Naruto's head hurt at the possibility, and he instantly dismissed it. The 4th had been too great a man to have simply chased the beast away. He would have dealt with it in the best way possible for the village. And what else could that be, but to kill such an untamable monster? Team Oboro, hailing from a Megakure, never even saw it coming. Their plan had been to wait to the midpoint of the exam, so that the strongest teams would have finished and the weaker teams would have worn themselves out. They were still in top shape and pumped for action by then, and with their nearly perfected strategy of genjutsu and clone techniques, procuring a plate from the first exhausted genin team, from Suna, as it were, that passed by had been like taking candy from a baby. Armed with the necessary plates and the intelligence that their allied AIM team had given them prior to the exam, they'd been on course to reaching the exit of the maze and passing the second exam with ease. If they hadn't gotten so caught up in the elation of their seemingly imminent success, they might have lasted a few seconds longer. Their first indication of danger was when Mubi dropped his umbrella on the ground with a clatter. The boy himself quickly followed after, convulsing uncontrollably on the ground as white froth bubbled out from the side of his mouth. Reacting instinctively, Kagari and Oboro jumped away from their teammate, just in time to avoid the two kunai that now embedded themselves harmlessly in the ground. Kagari's and Oboro's hands both blurred. Bunshin no Jutsu clone technique. As several clones appeared around them with swirling clouds of mist, they rapidly continued to form seals in succession. Doden, Dochu Aigyo no Jutsu, Earth Release, Earth Swim Technique. The earth below them turned fluid, and the two rapidly sunk below its depths, leaving behind their clones. Sure enough, a few seconds later, the tremors of unmistakable battle filtered through the earth towards them. Oboro turned to Kagari, who nodded back at him, his eyes narrowed from behind his rebreather. The two burst back up to the surface, spinning in midair as their umbrellas rapidly spat out poison-tipped needles in opposite directions. All around them, as they stood back to back in their practiced stances, their sacrificial clones burst into mist. Oboro blinked at the dark clearing around them. Where are they? He hissed, looking around rapidly. Given that they hadn't even sensed their enemy creeping up on them, he hadn't expected to take them out so easily, but he hadn't expected the enemy to simply not be there. But all he could see was Kagari's anxious face besides his, and what was that small blue thing fluttering around above them next to that stalactite? Wait, was that a bird? This far underground? Before he could even open his mouth to yell out a warning, however, his remaining teammate dropped like a stone besides him, white froth creeping out from his orifices. Oboro felt his heart sink as he remembered the promise he'd made to his younger brother before he'd left the village. Quickly making up his mind, he threw his umbrella down on the ground and raised his hands. I surrender, he said loudly. Just let me and my teammates live and I'll give you our plates. Just as his eyes flicked down to his left pocket, he saw a flash of red above him. His heart thudded sickeningly. And then everything turned black. Naruto didn't know what to think, and this, there were no other words for it, simply bewildered him. He was no stranger to pain, and over time, he had gotten into the habit of analyzing the cause of everything that hurt him. He reasoned that to minimize pain, he had to understand it. But what he was feeling now wasn't the usual kind of pain, which was sharp and obvious. Instead, what he felt now was a blunt axe that hacked away at the fraying edges of his mind, as a numbing sense of disbelief and something else he couldn't name spread throughout his body. So go tell your village and your Hokage. Go tell them that Takigakure's raising up a weapon, in order to become one of the 5 great villages. Come and destroy it for us. Naruto had moved methodically to tighten the rope bindings around the 2 Takigakure genins, but his mind had already begun to race with the implications. If Mushimi was telling the truth, and his body language and tone all supported that he was, then first of all, this meant that there was more than one tailed beast still roaming the world. Naruto had tried once before to look up information about the 9 tails in the archive library, as he was unable to dismiss the feeling of uneasiness he'd gotten during Mizuki-sensei's Memorial Day lecture. And he had managed to ascertain one thing before being chased out by the Chunin librarian: there was absolutely not even a single scroll on its origins, its known powers, or its fate. Granted, he didn't think that there could have been extensive research on such a colossal force of nature, but the fact that there was absolutely no information on it could mean only one thing: that it was classified, not to be disclosed even to the shinobi. It gave him a headache to think of it, and Naruto had decided that it must have been one of the village's top secrets, something to be handled only by the elite and the Hokage himself, and certainly not by lowly academy students such as himself. And so, he had put his inquisitiveness aside. But now, he found himself being forced back into a similar train of thoughts. And as fearful as the thought of tailed beasts in the plural was, the second implication in the genin's words was, in Naruto's opinion, even worse, that these monsters of legend could actually be sealed away within people. He didn't know much about fuinjutsu, except that it was a type of jutsu that sealed objects within other objects. He'd always assumed there was a limit to what could be sealed, and what could be done with what was sealed. But if a tailed beast could be sealed within a person, and if that person could somehow harness the tailed beast's chakra, then such a person might very well be invincible. And Mushimi had said that Takigakure was raising up such a person, a Jinchuriki, he'd called it, in order to become one of the 5 great villages. Did this mean that all of the great villages had a Jinchuriki of their own? A weapon, that by all intents of nature, shouldn't exist. If that was the case, then could the 9 tails not in fact have been destroyed by the 4th Hokage? Could he have sealed it away instead? Inside a person. Maybe even a baby. Naruto suddenly recalled that the 4th had been a sealing master. He had found this out when he'd been trying to figure out what the black seal on his abdomen was. Come to think of it, he hadn't seen his seal in a long time. But that was because it only appeared when he nudged his red chakra. But why was he thinking of his red chakra now? He hadn't touched, or thought of it in years. Come and destroy it for us. Mushimi's hate-filled eyes flashed once more in his mind's memory. Naruto felt another headache coming. He knew those eyes very well. Where had he seen those kinds of eyes before? Hadn't they? Naruto. He jerked in surprise, his hand automatically reaching for the tanto strapped across his back. Besides him, Rai blanched and took a step back. Recognizing his teammate, Naruto immediately relaxed and let go of the blade's handle. Looking around, Naruto noted in surprise that the Takigakure genins were nowhere to be seen. In fact, they seemed to be walking somewhere. For a split second, he couldn't remember where and why they were moving. "What's up with you?" said Rai, eyeing him curiously. Naruto hesitated. "Nothing, I just spaced out," he finally said. The rest of the second exam passed by quickly and easily, despite their increasing misgivings. Naruto's shadow clone found an Omegakure team with 2 plates that had let their guards down enough for them to be sneaked up on. Mayu's genjutsu incapacitated 2 of them with ease, and after Naruto took down the 3rd with a simple chop across the back of his neck, they trussed up their second genin team to a boulder. With 3 plates now in their possession, they rested briefly before moving onwards, and after several more hours with no further confrontations, they finally reached the end of the maze. They emerged out of the sloping dark tunnel to see that it was midday above ground. They were somewhere in the desert away from the Suna village, and there was not a cloud in the sky. The strong sunlight seared their eyes after having spent days in almost constant darkness. Nevertheless, Rai flung himself on the hot sandy ground with a moan of bliss, soaking up the sunlight with his outstretched arms. Following him outside, a wide smile spread across Mayu's face even as her eyes squinted in pain. Naruto, on the other hand, remained tense, his eyes roving around as if looking for possible ambush spots. Rai, seeing this, rolled his watering eyes. "Naruto, we're finally out of that hellhole. Lighten up." Naruto ignored him, continuing his visual search. Rai sighed in long-suffering exasperation. But before he could say anything else, the sound of light footsteps alerted them to a Suna Chunin climbing up the hill towards them. His face was mostly covered with bandages and a face mask, and he wore the standard Suna flak jacket. The man held his hand out. "Plates, please." Immediately, Mayu began to reach inside the folds of her cloak, when Naruto flung out 4 shuriken from his holster. As the shuriken spiraled through the air towards the Chunin with a whistling sound, Rai let out a yelp of surprise, but instantly, the Chunin had his kunai out, and batted away the shuriken with ease. Mayu stared gapingly down at the shuriken embedded in the ground, and then back up at Naruto. Slowly, the Chunin lowered his kunai, and leveled a sharp gaze at Naruto. "Attack an examiner again, and you'll be disqualified from the exam." "What was that for?" Rai demanded. Naruto didn't apologize. "For all we knew, you could have been another examinee trying to take our plates at the very last second." It was difficult to tell the Chunin's facial expression from behind his mask, but Naruto could have sworn he saw something twitch. "My name is Subusa and I am one of the Chunin examiners for this year's Chunin selection exam at Sunagakure. It has been exactly 29 hours and 44 minutes since the exam began. Congratulations on passing the second exam." As Subusa led them back to the village, picking his way through a sandy path that only he seemed to be able to see, Naruto noticed several other entrances scattered around the ground. In the distance, he saw another worn-out team emerging up to the ground as a Suna Chunin patiently waited for them. "How do you guys know when to pick us up?" Rai piped up from behind him. "Cameras," said Subusa. Contrary to what some may have thought, the second exam was not meant to be an all-out battle royale, with the examiners being blind to its happenings. "And you guys wanted to see what the future ninja of other villages have got up their sleeves, eh?" "That too," Subusa admitted. "So did you see that girl that attacked us?" Rai continued. She creamed us. Naruto stopped short. At the same time, Rai let out a yelp of pain and stumbled forward. It appeared that Mayu had kicked him. What was that F? Oh. We did not have a camera in every tunnel, so we may have missed that one, Subusa replied calmly. Naruto's eyes narrowed. The pause before he'd spoken had been a millisecond too long. Naruto was certain that he was lying. And he would have bet his prized Tonto that every single Suna examiner and official knew of Takigakure's Jinchuriki. But for now, it seemed they would be feigning ignorance. The question was, had they found out from Mushimi's outburst, or had they known even before that? And if they had, why had they let her participate in their exam? Naruto and his team were brought past the village gate and inside one of the circular clay buildings. Contrary to its heavy and dull appearance, it was cool and airy inside, and they gratefully removed their heavy cloaks. Mayu sniffed her sleeve and cringed, thrusting the cloak away from her. To Rei's outrage, they were the second team once again to pass, this time having been beat out by Guy's team of rookies. The three rookies looked battered, but thrilled about their success. When Neji saw them enter, he gave them a cool smirk. With 3 days left as the second exam continued, they were guided to separate quarters where they could clean up, eat, and rest. After taking a long refreshing bath, and saying good night to his teammates, Rai looked disappointed. He had been excited about going out to explore the village, but had been told by Subusa that they were not allowed to leave the building until the exam was over in order to prevent sabotage. Naruto turned in early and tossed and turned in his bed all night. The next day, he rose early and was surprised to see that breakfast had been laid just outside his door. It was a tray of Suna cuisine, and nothing that he was used to. The meat was chewy and dry, and his soup, filled with something that looked like seaweed but tasted sweet. Nevertheless, as Naruto ate, he felt a touch of nostalgia, remembering back to the caretaker who had once prepared all of his meals. Strangely enough, he had never seen her again after she left him, and for the first time in years, he wondered where she was. Naruto couldn't even remember her face, all he could remember was that she had been stern, and quick with her hand. He suddenly wondered why he'd been left with a caretaker, and not in the orphanage like every other child in Konoha who'd lost their parents in the war. He'd never thought too deeply of it before, but now, he wondered how he could never have questioned it before. And yet, each question raised even further questions. After breakfast as planned, Naruto and his teammates assembled in the corridor that connected their rooms. Because their own clothes were dirty and being washed, they all wore the dark long tunics that was Suna's traditional clothing. While the clothes were surprisingly lightweight and cool, Naruto privately thought it made them all look lumpy and shapeless. He hadn't noticed the night before because it had been too dark, but now that sunlight had crept into the hallway, Naruto saw that there was a small window that looked outside. Stepping forward and peering out, he realized that it overlooked the center of the village market. The sun was still rising, and hung low in the sky, but he could see the market was already beginning to bustle with activity. I wonder how many teams passed the second exam, said Rai, with a great yawn. Since we ended with 3 plates instead of 2, that means we took out 2 teams, right? What do you think the third exam will be? Some kind of sparring match, probably, said Mayu, leaning against the wall. My brother told me that's what most villages do for the third exam when they host the Chunin exams. From what Naruto had been able to gather, Mayu's older brother was a Chunin who manned Konoha's village gates. Sparring, huh? Said Rai, scratching his nose. I hope I'm paired with someone easy then. Someone like Tenten or one of those other rookies. And not, let's see. Oh, I know. I really wouldn't like to go up against that, what did they call her? That Jinchuriki then. If she beat Naruto that easily, the rest of us wouldn't stand a chance. Glancing around the corridor to make sure it was empty, his voice nevertheless dropped an octave. Is it even fair though, having her in the exam? We're just genins, even Naruto here wouldn't stand a chance against a tailed beast. Mayu didn't respond. Assuming the third exam involves one-on-one sparring, it's not to say that you have to absolutely win your match to pass, said Naruto. The first 2 exams were to weed out the weak, now that only the strong genins are left, they'll be wanting us to showcase our abilities. So even if you lose to your opponent, if you make a strong showing, you could still pass. That makes sense, said Rai seriously. And then, a sly smile spread itself across his face, his scar twisting as it did so. Guess Tenten doesn't stand a chance then. Oh, this again. Just leave her alone. What do you have against her? Admonished Mayu. Everything, Rai shot back. Grow up. Tuning out the bickering voices of his teammates, Naruto continued looking out the window. this was the second village outside of his own that he'd ever seen in his life, and the similarities and differences he found were startling to him. The people of Konoha were more boisterous and familiar, greeting each other with wide grins and a slap on the back or a kiss to the cheek. The people of Suna, on the other hand, seemed much calmer and more reserved. As he watched, though people politely greeted each other good morning, there was always a certain distance between each other. Naruto wondered whether it was merely custom, or whether the extreme climates of the desert bred a certain kind of personality. Yet at the same time, he thought, people here also woke up early to go to the market to buy food to put on the table for their families. Suddenly, there was a loud banging noise just below his window. At the sound, Naruto reared back, his hand reaching for his tanto once more. There was a lull in the cacophony behind him, and striding over, Rai stuck his head out the window and glanced down. Someone just knocked something over, Naruto, he said, turning around. What are you being so jittery for? You've been really weird lately. It's nothing, Naruto said. I'm just tired. Rai shook his head, but let it go. Stretching once more and saying something about looking for the kitchen to get more food, the genin shot off down the corridor. As soon as he disappeared around the corner, Mayu mumbled something about looking for something, and fled into her own room. After a moment's hesitation, Naruto walked back to the window and looked down. Pieces of a red clay pot were scattered on the ground. Though the contents seemed harmless, for some reason, everyone in the market was giving it a wide berth. Standing in the middle, paying no attention to the beans strewn around his feet, was a boy who looked Naruto's age, with spiky auburn hair. But that was where the physical similarities ended. He was much paler, and wore Suna genin attire. Naruto was fairly certain he hadn't seen him in the Chunin exams. He knew he would have remembered someone like that in the exam. The boy was standing stiffly with his arms crossed, seemingly observing the flow of traffic that circled fearfully around him. Then without warning, the boy tilted his head back, and with wrathful black-ringed eyes, glared hatefully back up at Naruto. Naruto stepped back away from the window. Retreating to the opposite end of the corridor, where it was still dark, he leaned against the wall and slid down to the ground, massaging his temples. The blunt axe was back again, accompanied once more by that aching headache that prickled and lurked at the edges of his consciousness. I am, he said quietly to the familiar darkness. I am likely a Jinchuriki. Chapter 12. Stalemate. The faint moonlight made the water in the wash basin glow eerily. Looking down at his face reflected on the water's surface, Naruto grimaced as he recalled his recent revelations. He couldn't think of a word to describe how he felt. It was as though he had been blind, and his eyes had been newly opened to the real world. As though a bubble that had separated him from the truth had dissipated. But unfortunately, this reality had never been something he wanted. All of his musings from childhood seemed silly to him now. How could he have never connected the dots before? His entire life, the other villagers had isolated and despised him. Reasoning it out, he had concluded that their driving factor was hatred, and he now knew for sure that he hadn't been wrong there. But now he saw that there was an even bigger factor, namely, fear. He had been orphaned the night that the Nine Tails attacked, but unlike the other orphans, he had been kept separate from them. And that was because the villagers, unlike him, had known that something colossal like the Nine Tails could not have been defeated, not even by the fourth Hokage, but only sealed away. To think that for 10 years, they had had to live within the same walls as the monster that had killed their loved ones. Naruto gazed down at the whisker-like marks on the face that stared back at him from the water's surface. After a moment, he broke the surface of the water with his hand, contorting his reflection. Why had he never questioned the seal that appeared on his belly when he nudged the red chakra in his body? He had just dismissed it and never thought about it again after his initial curiosity. Naruto felt sick at the vague memory. How many other markers had he missed because of his lack of attention? Suddenly, feeling an overwhelming urge to vomit, he covered his mouth. His headache had been growing increasingly worse all day, and now his head was throbbing again. Panting, Naruto leaned back against the sandy wall for support as his surroundings spun dizzily around him. As soon as the nausea had passed, he splashed some of the cold water on his hot face and then went to lie down on his bed. His heart pounding, he dazedly wondered whether he had contracted some kind of strange desert bug, before his heavy eyes closed shut. The day the second exam ended, everyone who had finished was taken out to the field of dunes where all the tunnels opened up to the surface. With the exception of the Konoha rookies, it was the first time since they had come into Suna that they had seen any of other genins. Taking a cursory look around during their short walk, Naruto noted that besides his and Neji's team, only Kabuto's team had made it from Konoha. However, none of the teams from the other villages seemed to have fared any better. Overall, they looked rather more disheveled and worn down. At the field, as expected, a large number of Suna shinobi officials were waiting. However, standing beside them were a number of foreign jonin, including one very familiar face. Kakashi-sensei, Mayu called out in surprise, coming to a stop. The jonin raised a hand in casual greeting as he strolled over. So you guys are still in one piece, I see. Did you expect any less? Rai snorted, folding his arms across his chest. Ever since he'd been kicked out of the Suna kitchen, he had been in an irritable mood. Are you supposed to be here? Mayu asked skeptically. Hey, now, it's custom for the sensei to be present during the third exam, Kakashi explained. In fact, there are usually a substantial number of spectators from every village during the third exam. After all, the Chunin exam is what decides which ninja will be showing up on the battlefield. Mayu's eyes widened. But all the nations here are allied, aren't they? Alliances can, and have, changed in a heartbeat, said Kakashi in a solemn voice. The man, or woman, you shared a drink with over the campfire could be the one to stab you in the back when the fire dies. Suddenly, he clapped his hands together, startling them. But enough of that business. You three should just concentrate on the upcoming exam. As if taking that as a cue, the Suna Chunin who had picked them up, Subusa, raised a hand in signal. Kakashi, as well as the other foreign jonin returned back to their formation. When the genin had all amassed into a single group, he spoke. As of now, the second test of the Sunagakuer Chunin exam is, the rest of his sentence was cut off, as with a sudden flurry of sand, a red and white figure burst out of one of the tunnel holes in the ground. Phew. I almost overslept, that was way too close. As one, all heads turned to stare at the genin who casually brushed the sand off her head. Isn't that, Fu? Rai hissed unnecessarily into Naruto's ear. Hearing her name, the green-haired Kunoichi looked their way with an unexpectedly hard expression on her face, and Rai involuntarily took a step back. Ahem, Subusa caught their attention with a cough. As I was saying, as of now, the second test of the Sunagakuer Chunin exam is now over. Taking into account the most recent arrival, 24 individuals coming from a total of 11 teams have passed. Congratulations. At this point, a particularly bedraggled-looking AIM team was unable to contain their joy, triumphantly thrusting the tips of their umbrellas up into the air. The cage will now address you all. Subusa nodded towards the group of Suna shinobi, which parted in the middle to reveal a robed figure of middling size. Stern dark eyes bored into them from beneath the green-pointed hat that denoted him as the strongest shinobi of Sunagakuer. Congratulations on making it this far, said the cage in a deep and raspy voice. However, it is too early to celebrate. He pointedly looked towards the celebrating members of the AIM team, who shrunk under his gaze. The Chunin exam is a valuable tool for evaluating the performances of the future generations of shinobi. You can think of everything until now as a preliminary test to weed out the worthless from those with potential. It is only from this point onwards that your mettle will truly be tested. The third exam, which will take place 2 weeks from now, will be a series of fights in which you must be the victor, in order to proceed to the next round. Rai nudged Mayu, who had paled. I cannot stress enough the importance of your display during this third exam. You may be merely genin now, but you will, in the future, be the soldiers of your village. In a sense, you are showing the strength of your village to the other villages. A weak showing will reflect poorly on your village, and invite stronger villages to take advantage. In essence, from here on out, you are determining the futures of your villages. The cage looked balefully around at them, it was completely quiet. Now, according to your individual performances from the first and second exams, every person, with no regard for nation or team, has been divided into 8 separate brackets. The victors of each bracket will face each other, until there is only one remaining, who will be guaranteed a pass in the exams. Breaking the silence, the group of genins began to murmur amongst each other. The cage raised a hand to quell them. This does not mean, however, that only one person will be passing. From this moment on, every single one of you is being considered for a promotion to the Chunin rank. So I expect you all, as representatives of your respective villages, to prove yourselves in these rounds. At these words, a tall and bald Suna jonin stepped forward. Thank you Cage-sama. I will take it from here, said the jonin, bowing deeply. He straightened up and turned to look at them. My name is Satetsu, and I will be the head referee for the third exam. To start things off, due to the larger than expected number of remaining contenders, there will be a preliminary round. You will be divided into divisions where 3, instead of 2, genins will fight each other. There will be no rules besides that you must remain in this field. The fight will continue until 2 of you are dead, knocked out, or admit defeat. There may also be a situation in which the winner has been clearly decided. Rather than unnecessarily adding blood to the field, I will step in and declare the victor. He cleared his throat. Now then, you were each individually evaluated during the first and second exams, and using these results, the divisions have been drawn to be as fair as possible. Several Suna Chunin rolled out a large white cloth with a tournament bracket chart etched on it in dull black ink. Naruto found his name immediately. It was the first name written in the very first bracket. The 2 names next to his were Kabuto and Karen. Scanning the rest of the brackets, he saw that almost all the other Konoha genin had been split up into separate brackets. It seemed that by fair, they had meant that they intended the strongest genins to face each other in the later rounds of the tournament rather than in the preliminary. Likely to provide the most entertainment for the various high-ranking country officials that would be coming to view the actual third exam. His gaze lingered momentarily on Mayu's bracket, which was 4th. One of the names was unfamiliar to him, but the other name was Fu. Either they had scribbled Fu's name into one of the brackets as soon as she emerged, or more likely, they had known she had passed, and had proactively written her in. Naruto glanced at Mayu, but for once, her face was unreadable. We will commence with the preliminary round of the third exam immediately. First up is bracket 1, Uzumaki Naruto from Konoha, Yakushi Kabuto from Konoha, and Karen of Kusagakur. They're sure not wasting any time, Rai grumbled, scratching his scar. Good luck, Naruto. Not that you need it. Mayu nodded. Good luck, Naruto. Wordlessly, Naruto stepped out onto the field. Kabuto walked past him, his sandaled feet crunching in the sand, and turned around to face him several meters away. A bespectacled girl with flaming bright red hair and eyes wearing a Kusagakur Hitai 8 did the same, finishing the triangle. At the same time, several Suna Jonin stepped out, and with a jutsu, raised a circular sand barrier that separated the bystanders from the 3 genin, creating a makeshift arena. Are you ready? Said Satetsu. Yes, said Naruto and Karen simultaneously. Kabuto silently adjusted his glasses. Then, begin. The girl seemed to have judged Kabuto as the easier of the 2, she immediately flung several kunai in his direction. Barely dodging them, Kabuto tripped over his own feet, and fell on the ground. Karen began running towards him, but skidded to a stop when he raised his hand. There was a momentary silence, before Satetsu cleared his throat. Yes. I forfeit, Kabuto said, looking embarrassed. He stood up, dusting the sand off his pants, and began to limp back to the wall of the barrier. My foot's been bothering me since the second exam, and I doubt I can carry on much longer. Personally, Naruto thought that the limp looked fake. It was much more likely that Kabuto had ascertained that he had no chance against the competition of that year, and had just chickened out. That was so not cool, man, said Rai, shaking his head. Hearing him, Kabuto gave a sheepish smile before going to the back to sit beside his teammates. Okay then, Kabuto Yakushi from Konoha has been eliminated from bracket 1, Satetsu rolled his eyes. He raised his hand once more. Continue. Naruto hadn't moved since stepping out onto the field. This seemed to unsettle the Kusa genin. Hesitating for a second, she flung another pair of kunai at Naruto. Deflecting the kunai with his own, Naruto stayed otherwise still. Running around him in circular motions, Karen continued to throw kunai at him, all of which he blocked. Finally, apparently having run out of artillery, she launched herself at him with surprising speed, leaving a small cloud of sand in her wake.